Okay, thanks everyone for joining us tonight for our webinar of the month with Randall J. Hodges. And by way of introduction, we've had him on before and everyone loves his energy and his storytelling, so we're very excited to have Randall again. He is an all-in-camera shooter, and that means he makes all of his adjustments in the field using tangible tools like Singh-Ray's lens filters instead of using post-processing in software. He's been a full-time professional photographer for almost 20 years and has galleries both in Washington and Oregon. Most of his work comes from time spent hiking and backpacking the wilderness areas of the western United States. And he's hiked and photographed over 27,000 trail miles, and that may be an old number, Randall.
32,500.
32,500. And Randall's work has been published more than 4,500 times worldwide in books, magazines, calendars, newspapers, and more. And if you guys want to find more of his work after tonight, you can check out his book. It's called Images of the West, a full-color landscape photography book featuring 20 years of his all-in-camera photography of the West. And with that, Randall, I'm going to let you take over.
Okay, hey, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight for this webinar. We're going to do a little adventure here. This is the story of an 18-day photography trip I took last November, so just a year ago now, to photograph the desert Southwest in the fall. What an epic adventure it was, and we'll get right on through that. Just a little touch about all-in-camera photography for those of you not familiar with my work. I'm not going to dig as deep into it this time as I have in past webinars, but I'll just give you a little snapshot. So I do shoot in RAW. I do all the work in the camera, which entails setting up the color palettes that are in every digital camera and mirrorless camera. Most people don't know they're in there and don't set them up and use the color controls in the camera, but I do. And I've set them up to match my old school slide films. Some of you out there might be like, slide film, what is that? But anyway, old school film. I shot a lot of Kodak, so in my camera I can mimic Kodak Ektachrome, Kodak Kodachrome, Kodak Elite Chrome. I can also mimic Fuji Velvia and Provia 2. So those color palettes I put in the camera. I also use a high contrast, what I call black and white color palette. Now, whenever I say roll of film, that's just old school term. I mean a digital preset in my camera that I've set up, but that is my digital roll of film. And then I just apply the old school film techniques to my camera. Every shot's on a tripod. I generally shoot through very small apertures, and I try to use as long as exposure as the subject matter will allow. Lowest ISO as possible. I control the white balance in the camera. And then the reason I love partnering with Singh-Ray is they are the only filter I recommend. It's what I use, and I use their graduated split neutral density filters, the Galen Rowells, all in hard stop for me. I carry a 1, 2, 3, and 4 stop in hard. I actually carry 2 full sets of that in case one of my filters fogs out in the field. I also carry a couple of the Randall J. Hodges Mountain V filters. And I also carry 4 Singh-Ray light bright warming polarizers. I use the thin mount because I am on a full frame camera. So I literally do all the work in the camera. There's no post-processing involved. There is a conversion of the RAW file to a TIFF file, which I use the camera software for, Canon DPP, Digital Professional 4. I convert the file. I zoom in. I do open it in Photoshop, zoom in looking for sensor dust and remove any artifacts that might need to be removed, copyright, keyword, the image internally, and then that's about it. And that's my finished TIFF file, which is ready for printing. And full disclosure, though, that doesn't mean that's it to get them to come out of the printer correctly. Each one of the printers I run needs a script or a profile run on that image in order to get that image to come out looking as close to the back of my camera as possible. I own a couple of galleries, the Randall J. Hodges Photography Gallery in Edmonds, Washington, and the Images of the West Gallery by Randall J. Hodges in Cannon Beach, Oregon. You come into one of my galleries, what I hope you see on the wall is exactly what you would have seen in the back of my camera standing out in the field with me. So that's kind of my standard. Want to make it really clear, just because I'm an all-in-camera shooter doesn't mean I'm a post-processor hater. I think that's how most people get their photography finished, is in post-processing, Photoshop, Lightroom, and all the other tools that are out there. Nothing wrong with that. I just like to be different, and I guess I'm an immediate gratification guy. I like to do all the work right in the camera and see it right there on the spot. I also use the back of my camera to sell a lot of work. So if you're in one of my galleries, a lot of people don't believe I do it all in camera. I'll just show you the back of my camera. You'll see for yourself. If you ever catch me out in the field, you'll watch me do it right there in the field. I also teach this technique all over the West in lessons and adventures from 1 day all the way up to 11 days. So if you're interested in all in camera shooting, come out and take a class with me, and I'll teach you how to set up your camera and do it all in the field right on the spot. So that's just a little bit about all in camera shooting. And let's go ahead here and get started with this big adventure in the desert Southwest. And I'm going to kind of run this webinar. Hopefully you'll join me on the adventure, see how I use Singh-Ray filters and all in camera technique out in the field as I progress through this trip. So with a little imagination, we'll all be in the desert Southwest here. Here we go. All right, first stop on this big adventure was Zion National Park. A beautiful place any time of year, but I think really special in May in the spring and in the fall in November. I had been to this location called the Subway on a couple of previous other locations, but it would always been in the spring, and it always had too much water in it to get this dream shot that I was after. So I wanted to make a point of hitting Zion so I could do this. I'll warn you, this is a bit of a hike and you need to get a permit. So make sure you call in advance to figure out how to do that if you want to see the Subway. And make sure you're a pretty good hiker with some backcountry skills to get up in here. It's about a 5.5 mile hike, but it feels like you'll have done 8 miles. So here we go. Aperture priority, F20, 12-second exposure, 2/3 of a stop dark. I shoot almost everything in aperture priority, use exposure compensation to lighten or darken the image. And this one shot at ISO 100. Try to keep that ISO as low as possible. Wide angle lens here, 16 millimeters. When you see the word landscape or standard, that's that roll of film I was talking about that I've set up to match slide film. And my landscape roll I call my Kodak Ektachrome, or excuse me, Elite Chrome roll of film. I control the white balance in the camera. This one is 6000K, and the filter used was a light bright warming polarizer. And so that's what allows you to see into the water in that pool there, that polarizer. And it also just intensifies that color because it removes reflection so that the camera can see the actual color and not a glare off the walls of this canyon.
So do you ever use a handheld color meter to get the right temperature?
You don't really have to anymore. Digital cameras have such a good meter, and more than that, over film, we have our eyeballs. We can look right at the back of the camera and determine if our photo's too bright or excuse me, if it's too cold or too hot when we're talking about white balance.
Right.
The in-camera histogram or handheld meters for that stuff is really more of a post-processing technique, and I never look at the histogram in my camera. I only use my eye to determine if I've taken a good shot or not.
And how did you decide on 6000K white balance?
I started this, well, we have some good, one thing about the desert Southwest, I live up here in the Northwest, and we have 3 lights. We have overcast light, direct sunlight, and shade light. But in the desert, you have a 4th light, a beautiful reflected light. And you can see as this image heads out of the canyon there, out of the Subway, you can see that reflected light reflecting in. You can kind of catch it under the curve of the ceiling in there. So I didn't need as high a white balance as I normally would shooting in the shade. But I believe my first shot was 5200K. That wasn't warm enough. My second shot, 6500K, little too warm. Third shot, right on the numbers. And while the light stayed like this, I was able to shoot 6000K the whole time.
Awesome.
And we'll just jump ahead here. This is a little shot I've been trying to take for many years also. Always been too much water running in there. That entire creek fits into this little crack, which is a couple of feet deep and only about 6 or 8 inches wide. In this one, aperture priority f22 because I was trying to achieve a longer exposure, 12-second exposure on that. One full stop dark, ISO 50, again, trying to use all my tools to get as long as of exposure as possible. Focal length 27 millimeters, that landscape roll of film, white balance 5600K, light bright warming polarizer on the camera, but you can see some reflection in this. So I actually only had it turned partially on. I really like the way the reflected light added dimension and dynamics to the image. So just like a rainbow, I recommend having a circular polarizer on and spin it while you look at the rainbow. You'll see the rainbow intensify. That actually means the polarizer is off, because a polarizer reduces reflection and glare, and a rainbow is reflection. But you'll get a more intense rainbow if the polarizer is on, set to the off position, rather than just have the polarizer off the camera altogether.
Interesting.
And we'll move on here. Towers of the Virgin. This is a relatively easy shot. Anybody can do this. You just park in a parking lot, walk behind the museum, and this is your staggering view. If you ever show up here, make sure you show up before light. I could have showed 20 images of this sunrise. They would have been all different tones from blue light all the way through. So make sure you show up plenty early. Aperture priority f18, 2.6-second exposure, one stop dark, ISO 100, focal length 28 millimeters, that landscape roll of film again, white balance again, 6000K was right, 3-stop Galen-Rauer split neutral density filter on this one. And really what I had on was a 2-stop and a 1-stop. I like to slightly offset them so I don't make a hard line in a photo like this. So often instead of using one filter, I'll put on 2 so I can just split them a little bit, and so you can't see the line in there. You'll also notice that my moon has no detail. It's very hard to get for an all-in-camera shooter because you have to jack your ISO up way too high. You ruin the quality of the image. I'd rather go ahead, let that moon blow out a little bit, keep the ISO low for higher quality prints. And we'll move on to the next one, which is just the next one in the series that morning. Now you'll see that light touching the peaks there. It also makes the other areas on the sides a little darker because we're getting more light on top there. And again, those 2 filters doing the work. And then if we go on to, and you notice my white balance dropped from 6,000 to 58 because the day is warming up. We're getting that warm sunlight, which means as that happens, my white balance will go lower and lower if I keep shooting the exact same image here. And we're gonna jump right to the next one where I just zoomed in, isolate a little bit. Now isolated, I dropped my aperture to f18. That also gave me a much faster exposure at 1.6 seconds because now we're getting that direct sunlight on there. You can also see I dropped my white balance again to 5200K. Still got that 2 filter making 3 stops with the Galen-Rauer split neutral density filter in there.
So did you want to explain a little bit the like here where it's like 1/3, or sorry, I think on the last one it was 2/3 to 1 stop dark. Are
Yeah,
you using an
that's
adjustable?
so some people like to shoot in manual, which means you are setting the aperture and you're setting the shutter speed. But I find that to be much slower. It is much faster to shoot an aperture priority. You select the aperture, the camera will select the shutter speed for you. Then you take the first shot, and then you can use exposure compensation to lighten or darken the photo very quickly. It's just a little graph with a 0 in the center and stops going in each direction. So I was at 2/3 of a stop when I zoomed in for this shot. I took the first shot. It was too dark. I brightened it by 1/3 from -2/3 to -1/3. Took the second shot. That's as fast as you can do photography right there.
Yeah. And you said you carry the hard line filters. Could you use a soft line filter instead of staggering the 2?
No, and if you come out for a class, you'll see in your gear requirements, if it's a sunrise or sunset class, you need to have a set of hards, a 1, 2, and 3 stop for your class. Then we can stack all 3 of those together to make 6 stops if we need to. A soft filter does not trick the camera into changing its exposure. It merely darkens the top of the sky a little bit. I actually need to fool the camera so it will take a longer exposure to brighten up that foreground. So for me, I only use hard stops.
Got it.
And on to the next one. We're into another location in Zion. This is called the Narrows. This wasn't my first time marching my way up through the canyon there. Again, it won't be the easiest hike for everybody because you're literally walking on round cobble rock right up the canyon. Um, the other times I've done it, again, it's been in May or June, and the water's been pretty warm. I didn't need special gear. The water on this day was 33 degrees, so we rented some basically some neoprene boots and neoprene pants to keep you warm while you made that march up the river. And this is another one, when you get out, you'll feel like you hiked a lot farther than the 4.5 miles I believe this shot is taken from. This is aperture priority f20, 5-second exposure, 2/3 of a stop dark, ISO 200, 16 millimeters wide angle lens on there. That landscape roll of film, white balance 8200K, and you can see that white balance is way up there. This is a deep canyon, and by the time the light gets to the bottom of the canyon, it's pretty cold light. So we crank that white balance up to warm it up as if your eye is looking at it. That's why such a high white balance on this one. And that circular polarizer is just critical, so you can see into the water and see all those beautiful rocks under the water there. For this one, the ISO did have to bump up. I really liked a 5-second exposure at ISO 100. It was 10 seconds. It just smoothed that water out too much. I lost all the detail in it. So for me, this was important. Little pro tip for you: I use a loop to look at the back of my camera, which is a little device that shades the back of your camera you put your eye up to. It also has a little focus on it for your eye, so your particular eye can focus on the camera, and if you have reading glasses, you won't need them with a loop. But this allows you to see the back of your camera so much more detailed. It's a $90 tool that will make you twice as good of a photographer without doing anything else, just because you'll see the detail in the back of your camera so much better.
Great tip. Is the Narrows not too far from the subway?
Yeah, they're in two different locations in the park. So for the subway, you actually drive out of the park and drive back in the park on a totally separate road, whereas the Narrows are up main Zion Canyon all the way to the end, and you have to take a bus from what we call Bridge Junction all the way to the end of main Zion Canyon, and then you hop off, hike a trail for a little bit, and then it's just going to end. Your choice is to turn around or get in the water. So I chose get in the water.
And then someone asked what brand of loop?
Hoodman.
Hoodman.
Hoodman. That's the one I recommend. That's what I recommend for my students. And if you come out for one of my bigger adventures, I don't say required, but I do say double asterisk strongly recommended. On to another one of Zion here. And we won't go through all the specs on this. We'll just have a look. Just another spot to take a beautiful shot. You can see that white balance is still up there high because the light hadn't really changed yet. But I did have to bump my ISO up to 400 on this one in order to cut that shutter speed down more. Again, I'm looking at the quality of the water and the drag it's making. I want the right details in there for my eye. One more from the Narrows here in another location, and same basic steps here. Kept that ISO up, and you can see it's getting a little darker in this part of the canyon because I'm at ISO 400 and I'm still getting a 12-second exposure. But really, ISO 400 is just as far as I want to take that camera, because in both my galleries, we make really big prints. And if you crank that ISO up too much, you're going to lose quality in those prints. All right, and I think we're going to move out of Zion, and the trip's going to move on here. And we're going to bump over. Actually, I made a stopover at the Grand Canyon with no good results. But I did do a couple of good scouting locations because we would be stopping back in the Grand Canyon on the South Rim at the end of the trip. So it's always worthwhile to go a location, even if you don't get any photos, because you can scout your photos and you know where you want to be, when you want to be there. You can get all that valuable information for later. All right, so now we're in Sedona, Arizona, and anybody who's ever been there probably visit Oak Creek Canyon, which is where we're at right here. Aperture priority f20, a third of a second exposure, 2/3 of a stop dark, ISO 100, landscape roll of film, white balance, 5400K. I've got a 24 millimeter on my focal there, and I didn't list it here, but I actually do have a circular polarizer on, just turned slightly on, and I'm hand holding a 2-stop Galen Rowell split neutral density filter over. I never screw a split neutral density filter holder over my polarizer. Well, one, I use a thin one. There are no threads. I can't. But two, that eliminates your ability to spin that polarizer. There are some holders that have drop-in polarizers where you can combine. I find those to be a hassle, not easy to use, much faster just to hand hold that filter right up over the polarizer, take a quick shot. And what I really went after this, and I nitpicked this composition to death, trying to get that reflection to really round out that photo. And luckily, I got a couple of good shots off right before a big German Shepherd jumped right in front of me and jumped in this pool and ruined everything. So I moved on. Well, actually, I think we got maybe one more shot from there. Yeah, there you go, the vertical. Another little pro tip there. Calendars love horizontal images. Magazine covers love vertical images. So if you're thinking publication and you're in a good location, you should definitely try to get both. And we'll move right on to the next photo here.
So, real quick, someone asked what's the difference between the light gray warming polarizer and the color combo polarizer?
Oh, okay. Great question. A color combo adds a blue cast to your polarizer. I have tried it. I know it works good for waterfalls for some people. It wasn't a good fit for me. I don't like to have the color cast in the image. It also besides the polarizer, it darkens the image by another stop, so you can extend that shutter speed for waterfalls. I don't necessarily ever need a longer exposure. So for me, just the straight up light bright warming polarizer is my choice. And the reason I choose a warming polarizer over a standard polarizer is a standard polarizer typically has a bit of a blue cast to it, which nowadays you can correct just by raising your white balance more, but I prefer not to. A warming polarizer negates that blue cast. So I think a warming polarizer has a truer tone. That's at least on my camera. Every camera sensor is different. So that's a personal preference for me. And again, for me, Singh-Ray makes the very best one. So that's what I go with there.
And how do
So
you control banding using a polarizer with your wide angle lenses?
oh, that's just something you really can't control. So you're just going to get some banding in certain photos. And the choice is take off that polarizer or zoom in a little bit so you're not so wide, which I will do because there's sometimes you just need the polarizer. Sunrise and sunset, I don't use a polarizer at all, so it's not an issue when I typically will have a wide angle lens on, is sunrise and sunset for me. Typically during the day, I'm shooting waterfalls, forest scenes, or whatever else I'm shooting. I need a little zoom. So I've typically got my 24 to 105, and I would only see that banding in that lens very early in the day or very late in the day. And again, I tend to not even put on a polarizer till an hour, hour and a half after sunrise, because I don't think it works correctly. It creates that weird banding, and it's still split neutral density filter time. The polarizer really works best middle of the day, unless there's no sky involved. If you're down in the forest shooting trails, waterfalls, creeks, rivers, you can use a polarizer from daylight to dark. No sky involved. But when you involve the sky, you need a little more, be a little more temperate with your polarizer there.
I've
And
had
so
a
for,
couple people ask how you set the film types in the camera, and I don't know if that's too complicated a question for
well,
injecting this evening.
yeah, it's a little bit more complicated than that, and we've gone through it in a couple of these webinars. I would just look up your color controls.
Mhm.
If you're on a Sony, they're either called color controls. Actually, all models of Sony call them a little bit different depending. For Nikon, it is uh, picture control. For Canon, it's picture style. They all have their own names, but all digital cameras and mirrorless cameras have these digital color palettes in them that I call. digital rolls of film. So you might just go through your actually they've taken that out of most of the camera manuals now because people just don't use those controls. They add color in Photoshop. That's just something you'll want to look up there a little bit. Or like I say, come out and take a lesson because I teach old school photography. The very first thing we do in class is we set up your camera and we give you 4 rolls of film, 3 color and 1 black and white. I could probably try for a half an hour to explain it and you still wouldn't know what I'm talking about because I would need some pictures and graphs and things to kind of help it along. So here's one. We backed out of the canyon a little bit and we're looking back at those great red rocks there. F20, 1.6 seconds, 2/3 of a stop dark. ISO 100, focal length is 85 millimeters on that one. White balance 5800K. 3-stop filter, pretty easy split there. You can kind of see, you just tuck it right almost to the bottom of those rocks that got the light on them and you're good to go. And moving on here. So this reaches a point in the trip where I do a little dedication. So this is called Shyla Sunset. You might have noticed a doggy on the home page of this screensaver. That was my German Shepherd mix, Shyla dog. She was my hiker helper for 14 and a half years. She hiked 8,500 miles in her career with me. She got to go all over the West, camping, hiking, and just being an all-around excellent photography helper. And at the time of this trip, Shyla was almost 15 years old, and she was starting to not do very well. And this day I got a call from my wife that it was Shyla's time. So I knew my wife, she got me a plane ticket, got it all set up so I could come home and help my doggy over the Rainbow Bridge. So this night when I shot this, I knew I was flying out of Phoenix to fly back up to Seattle and go help my doggy. And so I had her on my mind this whole evening. And I shot this sunset, which I thought was so fitting because I was shooting a natural bridge, knowing the next day I would have to go help my girl over the Rainbow Bridge. And so we'll just bump over here to the horizontal version of that. And Shyla helped me get a fantastic photo this night, which I really love. Aperture priority f20, 3.2 seconds, 1/3 of a stop dark, ISO 100, 24 millimeters, landscape, white balance 5800K, and a 4-stop split neutral density filter. I use 4 stops a lot on big open landscapes. Sometimes I'll pull out a 3 and a 1, or I'll use 2 stops in hard if I need to offset them. But you can see the line out there is pretty straight. So just a straight up 4-stop blends that line right out of there, balances the light right in the camera, makes for a fantastic photo.
Do you ever set your white balance in live view? Someone.
I do not. That's a great question, though. I only use live view for one thing. I'll turn on live view and I'll zoom in a couple of times, zoom down to the bottom of the image to focus in the foreground. I only use live view for focusing. I never shoot in live view. I never use it to set my white balance because live view is not the photo. So it'll throw you off. If you, in live view, white balance at 5400K may have looked just right for this image. Then you take a photo and realize, nah, it's not enough white balance. So, and what live view is also difficult to set filters. I try not to get my students using live view to set filters. Live view is slightly delayed. So my students will overset their polarizer a little, or they'll get their split neutral density filter a little bit wrong because of the delay in the live view. It's very small amount of delay, but it's just enough. So I like to do all that through the viewfinder. If you shoot in live view, you've just learned to make those adjustments naturally, and so no problem. But for me, I prefer to only use it to focus. I'll turn off live view, I'll take the photo straight up. All right, now we're just gonna have a little dedication about my beautiful doggy here. That's Shyla dog. On one of her hikes and one of her favorite spots. I have since hiked back up there and sprinkled her ashes all around in that nice grassy area there. She loved this area called Park Butte. When she was a younger girl, she'd get into this grass and just tear around crazy because it felt so good under her feet. And aperture priority f22, 1.6 seconds, 1/3 of a stop dark on this one. 35 millimeters, white balance 6300, 3-stop filter on. But if I was to judge my own photo, I needed one more stop of filter on there. The mountain is a little bit overexposed. My foreground's a touch too dark, but I was really focused on my doggie here. So she loved laying in that spot, and she just caught that little bit of sunlight right between her eyes, making a fantastic photo of her.
Well, and someone asked also, how do you decide when to use a filter or what filter to use?
Really just looking at the back of your camera. You need to judge how bright is the sky, how dark is the foreground, and you keep adding filter until those are balanced. So just using my eye, I can see that the glacier up on that mountain has lost some detail. I could have used a 1-stop over the 3-stop, which would have darkened up the mountain, brightened up the foreground, and more balanced this particular image. So that was a good time to ask, because right there, I made a technical error and I could have had a little bit darker filter on.
And was the filter at the top of the mountain or at the bottom of the mountain snow?
The filter was actually shoved a little lower than that. You can see the light right to the edge of the tarn there, that water, and it's shoved down right on that water where the sunlight is hitting. And that's typically the guide. You have sunlight in part of the photo and shadow in the rest. You want to try to get that filter, or at least one of the filters if you're using more than one, down on that shadow line. And we'll move on to another photo, one of my favorites of Shyla. She loved to sit in flower meadows and watch sunrises and sunsets. So she's out there keeping an eye on me while she's watching her sunrise, probably hoping a marmot will come out or something. We'll just move on to the next little one of my doggie here. This is my all-time favorite photo of Shyla. This one got published a couple of times. Shyla got to be in books and a couple magazines and stuff. Aperture priority f/18, half a second exposure, third of a stop dark, ISO 100, landscape rule of film, 6000K, 3-stop split neutral density filter. And that filter is a little bit above her head because I didn't want to darken her. So you can see behind her head, that's a little too bright normally, but I had a doggie involved, so we used it as best we could there.
And would you use the same settings on a mirrorless camera?
Basically, yes. A mirrorless will run pretty much just like a DSLR. You know, when picking a camera, the most important part for an in-camera shooter is the sensor tone of the sensor. For me, that means Canon is #1. Canon has the best tone. It will mimic Kodak film for me exactly. I have found, and you know, helping all my students, I get to have all cameras in my classes. If there's a new camera out, it's going to pop up in one of my next classes. And first thing we'll do is work through that camera and I'll figure it out. Nikons tend to have a yellow sensor, which means they shoot greens really well, but they struggle to shoot a blue-pink sky. They will typically turn the pink in the sky a little yellow, little orange. If you're using another brand of filter, let's say a Lee filter, it's going to enhance that yellow orange because a Lee filter has a gray yellow cast. So that's why, especially on a Nikon, actually for all cameras, but on a Nikon, you'd be very well served to have Singh-Ray filters over Lee filters or high-tech filters or any of the other brands out there, because it'll help your camera get the color that you're seeing out there. But for me, it's all about sensor tone. And here's how I'll rate the sensors right now. Canon first, Nikon second, used to be Sony second, but the newest Sonys that are coming out have a inherent pink magenta tone in the camera. So I got to bump them down below Nikon. And then would be Panasonic. Last is Fuji. Fuji has its own color palettes. They can get a little whacked out for me. I do know some pros that shoot Fuji who seem to handle the colors pretty well, but that inherent sensor tone from a Fuji. Any Fuji listeners out there, just plug your ears. I generally want to charge them double in my class. Fujis are kind of a nightmare to train on. So if you're looking for a camera that's easier to run, I'm sorry, Fuji, don't buy one of those unless you've already mastered Fuji. Canon also by far is the simplest camera to learn on. They have a screen called a quick view screen. If any of my students are out there, they'll know many times I say, wake up the camera, push your cue. That's for the quick view. Everything we do in a photo shoot pops up on one screen. And Nikon's pretty close to that. You can have a screen where you can do most of the work on that screen too. So, and now we'll say goodbye to Shyla dog, and I flew back to the desert, back to Sedona, and I'm back on the trip here. This was my favorite hike into Red Rock country. We scouted this the day, but oh, and I want to give a shout out if my buddy Randy is listening. Randy took me to the airport at Phoenix and dropped me off and let my car and my tent stay in camp. And then he came back the next day and picked me up. Shout out to Randy for that was a big help. So back in Red Rock country here, we scouted this the day before and decided this was the place for sunrise. So we did the hike again very early to get to this location, a couple miles in for sunrise. And you'll see right here, aperture priority f20, 1.6 second exposure, a full stop dark, ISO 100, focal length that's 27 millimeters in that landscape roll of film with a white balance of 5,000 K. Whenever light gets warm, and this sunrise really got hot, I mean, the colors were intense. A lower white balance will help you contain that. And again, I've got that 4-stop split neutral density filter on there. And then you'll just see here, just the light coming up more.
On that shot right there, sorry, was the filter at the bottom of the mountains?
Right in the middle. You have to make sure to get it all the way through the sky. So not quite at the bottom, but right in the middle there. And then you'll see here, same basic location, new foreground. And now the lights popped up, which has changed the light again. You'll see my white balance went down another click to 5100. Still got that 4-stop filter on there. And then the next shot, which I didn't show, it wasn't as nice as this. I had to put on another filter, making it 5 stops, because that light hitting those peaks getting brighter and brighter and brighter. And we still got to keep balancing light. Oh, so now from Sedona, we had a layover day in between to repack our gear for a backpack. We'd been cart camping up to this time, and now I'd gotten a permit to backpack and camp in Havasu, which is owned by Havasu Pai Tribe. Havasu Canyon is one of the most beautiful places you could ever be. It'll also be one of the most expensive camps you ever buy at $125 a night for your tent site, but so worth it if you can get a permit. And the only way to do it is to camp in there for 3 nights. You can helicopter in. I choose to hike in, beautiful hike. And this is the main falls, Havasu Falls here. And if you will, pay good attention to the color in this particular photo, because we're going to revisit this location a little later. This was shot on an overcast day. When we rolled into the canyon, it was overcast. That is one kind of light. That gives a very true white color to the water. It softens the colors with that balanced light. You can keep that white balance nice and low, 5200 K. This is ISO 50. I'm going for the longest exposure I can muster. F22, again, that small aperture creating that long exposure, 1/3 of a second exposure. That light, bright, warming polarizer was critical, so we could really see into that water and get all that color out of that water. And one thing I should mention is I am always focusing somewhere in my foreground. When you're using a small aperture and you're trying to create a big depth of field, you can't go focus out at this waterfall. Your foreground will be soft. I don't focus on the very first thing in the photo, but I focus about 5 or 10% into the photo. In this photo, it's that foreground rock on the right upper edge there, just far enough from me, perfect to focus on. Everything is in focus in the photo. And this will be a horizontal version of that same thing. Again, that overcast sky giving this very white look to this water here. And just keep that in mind when we circle around in a couple of days. Well, a couple of minutes to us, a couple of days to those of us down on the ground there. And basically the same stuff there. F22, 1/2 second exposure, 1 full stop dark, ISO 50. 24 millimeters on my focal length, and my landscape roll of film, white balance 5200 K. And we made it to camp. We set up camp and immediately headed out because it was already getting late to go see if we could get a shot of the next waterfall, Mooney Falls. Now you can see this waterfall's got a little bit more of that bluish tone because the sun came out. And now we're shooting in shade light. And you'll also see my white balance is considerably higher at 6800 K, trying to warm up that really cold what I call blue light or shade light. Aperture priority f20, 2.6 seconds, one stop dark, ISO 200. Trying to control that shutter speed, didn't want it to go longer than that. Focal length 24 millimeters, white balance 6800 with that light bright warming polarizer. And that was the end of, oh no, we still had one more shot there, I think. And this is just another take on Mooney Falls, same waterfall, throwing in some of those travertine pool waterfalls in there. Just beautiful. I'm going to step back here a second. And you notice the craziness of the cliff around this waterfall. That is actually created by the mineral in the water. It also piles up that mineral, that sediment, and it builds these little travertine lips, which one is in building in the foreground, and this one is very small still, only about 12 inches tall. But over the years, that sediment will keep building up, and eventually that'll be 2 or 3 feet tall, creating a much better foreground in there. But about every 10 years, Havasu gets a flood, and it wipes out all the travertine pools, and the process starts over. But that's that sediment that created the cliffs you see in this photo. And here you can see this one survived the flood, and those travertine little waterfalls are much bigger. And the foreground, I just love that, what I call the fingers, where the water crawls over the rocks down in there. And this one, we have f20, 3.2 seconds, one full stop dark using that exposure compensation. ISO 200, focal length 33 millimeters, landscape roll, white balance 6800K. That light bright warming polarizer is still on there. So, and we're moving.
Do you make notes on the settings when you're taking the shots? How do you remember what
Luckily, besides the filters, this is all stored in the metadata in the image.
Nice.
So if you are in Photoshop, you can do file info. You'll get most of this. But luckily for me, I hadn't erased this card. So I could go back and double check that what I'm putting to you was true.
And then Eric wants to know, why do you shoot with an f-stop of 20 to 22? Are you not concerned about the image softening due to the physics of the lenses?
So when we talk about, and that's a great question, when we talk about the physics of a lens, that is completely different than depth of field.
Okay.
Most lenses shoot the sharpest between f8 and f13, depending on the lens. That doesn't mean front to back sharpness. That means in the center of the photo, that lens will shoot the sharpness. And I think he's talking about a little bit of diffraction, maybe in the corners of a picture at f22. If you're what I call a pixel peeper, and you're going to zoom in, 100-fold over till you're looking at pixels in your photo, yep, you're going to see a little fall apart on the corners there. I'm not in the business of pixel peeping. My customers see very large prints on my wall at a distance. And I always invite people who say, hey, what about diffraction? What about going beyond the lens capability? And I just say, step up to that 40 by 60 and tell me where you see it. To a naked eye, you just can't see it. So I'm more about that old school theory that you're going to get more in focus front to back. Don't worry so much about the edges or the corners of the photo and that long exposure. So by backing off of that aperture, say to f13, you've given up a lot of that long exposure. Now you have to use a density filter to create a longer exposure, and a density filter changes the color tone of your picture. So I'd much rather just go old school, f20, f22. Almost all my photos are shot that way. And shoot it. And just for me, and this is, again, there's no absolute rule in photography. Actually, the only absolute rule in photography is there is no absolute rule in photography. So everybody has to find what is best for them, works for them. If you do post-processing for 10 hours on one image and it makes you happy, then you're doing it right. Even doing 15 minutes of post-processing on an image makes me very unhappy, meaning I'm doing it wrong. And I need to do it better in the field. So each photographer should find what makes them happy, and they should really master that. And don't be a follower. If you start liking one guy's images, a lot of people might make the mistake of, buying his videos to learn his post-processing techniques, and then they'll even show up in his exact same spot and try to recreate that shot. I hope for all the photographers out there that they'll have their own artistic vision and learn from multiple photographers, multiple techniques, and somehow blend that up into your own technique that makes you very happy. That I think to me is the key of photography. Make sure it's making you happy. Otherwise, there's just no reason to do it. I shoot in camera photography because I like instant gratification. And when I see a shot like this in my camera, you will hear me out in the field go, pow, nailed that. That's in the bank, because I am so excited. And that's why I do it. It makes me so excited.
On this shot, and I think the shot before, where did you place your focus, and what was that rule of thumb that you gave about that?
So about 5 to 10% into the picture, or the first noticeable foreground thing. For this one, it's that tiny little 12-inch lip that the water's coming over in the foreground. That's exactly where I focused. And on this particular photo, I did turn on live view, and I zoomed in to a little leaf that you can't quite see with the naked eye until that leaf was, a big part of the frame, and I focused in it. I mean, crispy. I know it's going to be crisp, and I used my loop to do it. Then I turned off live view and I took the shot. And that's a great question. Just, somewhere about 5 to 10% in your foreground is what I recommend. All right, we'll move on down the canyon here. This is hiking down to Beaver Falls, and a little spot where the fall color was just a little more on. And we had to do the hike downriver, you have to cross the river 3 times. So if you ever go to Havasu Canyon, just note you're going to get wet. Good news is the water is 70 degrees year round because it's spring water. So even though it was fall and the temperature outside was not ideal for swimming, the water wasn't freezing. But we did have to stop, take off our boots, put on water shoes, and we hiked in shorts the whole time, even though it was cold out. Just extra clothes on top, and halfway across, I'm like, that's a shot. So I had to go drop my gear on the other side, get out the camera, walk right out, stuck the tripod right in the middle of the creek there to grab this shot. And aperture priority F20, it's a 0.6 of a second exposure, a stop dark. That white balance is up to 6,600K again, because we're shooting that. Now we're getting later in the day, so the light's getting warmer. So at least in this spot, the white balance wasn't quite so cranked up. And again, polarizer a must. Creeks, waterfalls, forest trails, got to have that polarizer on. Beaver Falls. I've been to Havasu Canyon before, and I dreamed of getting this shot. I didn't get it the first time around, and I couldn't wait to get to this spot. Believe it or not, I was trying to get a permit for April or May, but I'm so glad I couldn't get one till November, because one thing you'll notice in this photo, there's nobody swimming in the water. And in April or May, it would have been 90 degrees out. You could never have gotten this shot. And so here's my first, this is a compositional one here between this and the next one. I shot this, I thought I had completely nailed it. I was completely happy. Aperture priority F22, 0.6 of a second, 2/3 of a stop dark, ISO 50, again, trying to get the longest exposure possible. 32 millimeters on that landscape roll of film with that white balance at 6,400, and that polarizer is on. And I sat down and I was pretty much just staring at it. There's a little picnic table right there, and just like, wow, this is so beautiful. But luckily, I rooted around, I poked through the tree to the right there and realized there was another place to put the tripod, and I upgraded the shot with this one. And for me, it was a huge upgrade. I'm just going to go back. So if that was the only shot you'd saw, you'd be so happy. But on the left side of this picture, there's something wanting for me there. It's like a negative space in the photo. I've got it framed with foliage and nice red rock canyon all the way around, except for the left bottom corner there. And now you'll see in this photo, now I've got that red rock in the corner, and I've added another fall color tree, and now the image is complete. F20, 0.8 of a second. It got darker just while I sat there. 2/3 of a stop dark, ISO 50, 100 millimeters. Oh, that's not 100 millimeters. Made a mistake there. I'm thinking that's 32 millimeters. White balance 6,400K with a light bright warming polarizer. And this is in both my galleries. I love this shot. And sometimes I get so attached that I don't care if anybody else likes it. I just love this one.
We have a couple of questions about lenses.
Okay.
What is the most common lens you carry for these type of images? And then the majority of your lens selection is the 24 to 105 for the open areas. And do you have like a rule of thumb as far as the tight shots in the canyon itself? Is the 116 to 35 for?
I would say you could do this hike without a wide angle lens. I chose to do it without a wide angle lens. One for weight. It is an 11-mile hike in, and you have to carry 4 days of food. So that's a consideration. And two, um, only a couple of times have you seen me say 24 millimeters, which means I didn't even max out what I was carrying. Um, I generally only add another lens when I know there's a need for it. And that does mean sometimes I have to go do the hike again because I wish I'd had a wide angle. And the other time I always have a lens in my pack is on the beach. I almost always shoot my wide angle lens on the beach, but I'm not secure enough to leave the 24 to 105 back at the car. So always on the beach, I'm going to have both lenses in there and shoot whichever one's appropriate. But because I'm a backpacker, there's always it. And believe me and my friends, we will walk away from the car a couple of times. Should we get that lens? Should we get it? No. Should I take it out? Should I put it in? Should I take it out? I mean, that thing weighs a lot. You hold that in your hand, you're like, dang. So, I have another 1 to 400 lens. That's like weighs 7.5 pounds. That thing ain't going in the backpack unless I know I'm going to pull that out. So I'll just go over my lenses. The 24 to 105 Canon, it's the f4 Mark II, #1 lens, most used. Second most used lens is the Canon L series 16 to 35 Mark II f4, second most used lens. Third most used lens, believe it or not, is 100 millimeter macro, and it gets a big bunch of use in the spring. Tulips are out, flowers are out. I like to do macro. I teach a lot of macro. And the least used lens is my most expensive lens, which is the Canon 100 to 400 Mark II, which I only break out when I just absolutely know there's a need for it. I'll keep it, in my van, but it's not going in the backpack because that's just that thing. It doesn't do you any good to have all the lenses if you can't make it to the location.
Sure. And do you use a shutter release with the slow speeds, or do you set the camera to its timer to take the image?
Oh, no, I do not prefer a timer. I need to know when I'm taking my picture. So I always have a cable release, actually always 2 cable releases. Even when I backpack, I have 2 cable releases and 2 polarizers. Breaking a polarizer in the field means game over for me. So, and typically like on this 4-day hike, I had 6 batteries. The 50 megapixel. Oh, and by the way, I shoot a Canon 5D SR. It's a 50 megapixel monster, and it's a battery killer too. So you got to make sure you have lots of batteries on there. And then on the way back to our camp, we discovered this little spot and shop, and I just named this Paradise because if you look up Shangri-La in the dictionary, it should have a picture like this in there. This is just as good as it gets. Dreamland. You're in dreamland the whole time. A big reason why I do what I do is I love to hike. I hike 1,200 to 1,400 miles a year. It's just as important to me as the photography. And when you can have a spiritual connection while hiking and doing photography, that's what the game is all about. And the whole time I was in this canyon, it just felt magical to me. I just felt like I was in a magical place. I was magical. My camera was creating magic. Everything was magic. This is one of those special places. And so I love this shot too. Aperture priority f22, 0.6 of a second, 2/3 of a stop dark, ISO 50, 32 millimeters on that focal landscape roll of film, white balance 6400K with that polarizer on. Now we made it back to camp, and I noticed that all the campers' headlamps kept reflecting up or hitting the canyon walls. I thought, great time for a star photo. So after a couple of short, I set the camera to manual, and I'll set it to like ISO 1000 or 2000, depending on the light. Set it to 20 or 30 seconds. Take a few practice shots with short star photos like you would for a Milky Way. And I do believe I shot a Milky Way shot here. You can see the cloudy Milky Way in this long exposure right across there. But I mostly do that to get the color right and the focus right. It's very hard to focus at night. So got that stuff right. Open this guy up. This is a 25-minute exposure at f4 in bulb. Another reason to have that locking cable release, because you can't lock your camera open without it. It's rare I would raise my ISO to 200 in a star photo, but I didn't want to wait around for a 50-minute photo. So raise the ISO to 200. That says 16 millimeters. I lied. I took a wide angle lens and it's in use right there. White balance all the way down to 4000K because stars photos and night photography is different. When the camera stays open that long, it keeps pulling color. So you need to go down on that color quite a bit when you're shooting, and I'll go lower than that, 3200K sometimes. And no filter needed for a star photo there. I was really happy with this photo. I really wished I would have taken a horizontal, so I just made a note. The next night, I would try a horizontal photo if conditions were right. And also a little pro tip here that we rotate around the North Star kind of. So if you just see the rotation here, you can see the North Star is going to be tucked into that cliff to the right there.
And then someone said, canyons are notoriously windy, yet your tree leaves are always sharp, even with the long exposure. Is it magic?
It's not magic, it's patience and a bit of luck. If I showed you all the photos in my camera from Havasu Canyon, well, actually, I didn't bring them home. I knew the wind blew in the image. I deleted it right away. I try to do that when I can see physical movement with my eye, delete that image, because I don't want to have to. Sometimes I have to shoot 50 clicks to get one where the leaves are sharp. And then still yet, if I make a 40 by 60 print, you're going to find a couple of leaves in there that were a bit blurry. But I will say this is a pretty deep canyon and it stayed pretty wind free most of the time. So really lucky there. But nope, I was just recently shooting a famous waterfall in Oregon called Multnomah Falls. I shot 60 exposures. That foreground just wouldn't hold still. I only walked away with one shot out of 60 clicks. And at the time I thought, oh, I've got a dozen to choose from. Nope, one shot. That's all I could muster. Post processors would probably take 2 shots, a long exposure and a very short exposure to freeze those leaves. Put those together, you can overcome that problem. I think we're day 3 now, and we finally got time to go back up towards the hike that we went in and see a new falls. This is 50-foot falls. This used to be called Narada Falls, but one of those floods actually changed and removed one of the waterfalls, kind of split it in two. This was a pretty magical morning because it made a lot of its own mist because that water is 70 degrees. So early in the morning when it's 35 degrees out, some mist would float up, cover the falls. I picked one here that didn't have a lot of mist in it. But per your last question, if you look at those foreground leaves in the front of this one, you can see they're not sharp. And I didn't get one sharp image with those leaves the whole time I stood there. So this waterfall was kind of creating its own wind, and I just couldn't overcome it.
And then do you have one of the Astrovision filters? Have you played with that yet?
I have, but I don't care for them. They're a darker filter. They slow down the camera, which means for a guy like me who's not stacking star photos, I'm just taking one photo in the camera. I can't have any filter on at all.
Okay.
I think if you're stacking star photos and you're wanting to clean up what we call a brown sky, that filter would help you blue up that sky. For me, that's more of just timing. If the sky is turning out a black or a brown rather than a blue, it's not the right night for a star photo for me. So that's something for those of you who might stack star photos, and maybe instead of taking a long exposure, you take 30 or 50 short exposures and stack them together to create star trails. You might enjoy that filter. Worth a try.
And do you do astrophotography at night when you're out in these dark locations, or like nighttime images with the moonlight?
Oh, sure, for sure. But again, it's all in camera stuff. So my Milky Way shots will never look like what you see on social media where you can see nebulas and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You know, for post processors, plug your ears, that's a fake image. That's not possible. Your eye doesn't see nebulas. That is done through star tracking, where you have a device that tracks the movement of the earth, so you can keep taking the same exposure over and over, or it's done with two different lenses or two different shots. So they would shoot a long exposure of the foreground so they could get foreground detail, and maybe switch lenses, maybe just leave the same lens if they've got like an f1.8 or an f2.8 lens, and shoot a very faster image of the Milky Way and composite those together. Nothing wrong with that. That's just for an all-on camera shooter. That's not possible. That's just not a possible shot. So like I said, no right way or wrong way in photography, just your way. So I don't like composites myself. I call that digital art. I can sure enjoy it when I view it, but I sure appreciate that the photographer lets me know this is a composite. So I know I'm not looking at something the eye saw. All right, this is back to Havasu Falls. And remember when we started at Havasu Falls, I said pay attention to the color of that water. Now we're at that blue water stage because we don't have an overcast sky. We have a waterfall in shade, f20, 1.2 seconds, one stop dark, ISO 100, focal lengths 28 millimeters, white balance 6600K with that light bright warming polarizer on there. And we'll move on here. There we are. That's almost identical to the shot I took at the beginning of the Havasu trip. And you can see that blue tone in the water, which I actually prefer for this waterfall because there is that sediment in the spring water. By eye, the water looks like glacier water. So when it looks, that overcast sky makes it look a little too white. That's not actually what it looks like. It has that glacier look to it from that sediment that's just in this water. So this represents Havasu Falls a little bit better for me. F20 at 1.3 seconds, 2/3 of a stop dark, ISO 100, focal length 25 millimeters, white balance 6600K, that polarizer on. So if you're a post processor and this was a windy day, I think you'd overcome that wind in the trees simply by taking one fast exposure so you could capture the trees, and then you take your long exposure and blend them together, or maybe you be blending together multiple images. And when it comes to the post-processing world, there's no limit to what can be done. And again, I have no issue with post-processing. For me, I just prefer to know if I stood there, am I going to see what's in your photo? If you decided to drop a moon in there or drop a sky in or composite a mountain goat in or put wildflowers that weren't there in, I'm looking at a nice piece of digital art. I'm not looking at a photograph. I can still fully appreciate that digital art. I just prefer to know that that's what I'm looking at. So for me, I wished all photographers would just be straight up and claim, hey, this is a composite, or, I took some liberties here that let you know that not all the elements were in this photo. Is I don't care if you spent 10 hours creating a photo, but if I could stand there and see all the elements that are in that photo, I still call that a photograph. But once you add something not in the photo, then we've moved on to digital art. And now we'll make a move
And
here.
when you say one stop dark on your metadata, what do you mean? Is that a filter you're using or a camera setting?
No, that's that exposure compensation. So again, when you're in aperture priority, you're picking the aperture, the camera is giving you the shutter speed. And typically, if your exposure compensation is set to 0, you're going to take the first exposure and it's not going to be the right exposure.
Okay.
So you use exposure compensation to either force the camera lighter or force the camera darker.
And why wouldn't you bracket instead of doing it that way?
Well, then I've got 3 photos to try to figure out instead of just the one I want. So I think this is, and for you people that bracket, I'm not a hater of that, but in the field, your eyeball should have seen which one was right, and you only need one of those photos. Unless your goal was to put those 3 photos together, then that's where a bracket makes sense. But a bracket is something we used to do more in film days because you couldn't see your photo. You didn't know if a 0 exposure or a plus half a stop bright was right or a half a stop dark. So maybe you shot all 3 on film, and then you'd go get your slides developed, and then you knew one of those shots was correct. With a digital camera, your eye can just see that's too dark. Brighten it up a click, take another photo, delete the dark one, keep the good one. That's my way anyways. And that might be the last shot. Yes, it is.
All right. Well, we have some questions I've been saving up.
Good. Let's do
If
it.
anyone has questions while we're going through these, put them in the Q&A window and we'll hit those. Someone said, you mentioned earlier that you were walking up or down the temperature scale. Is it mainly trial and error versus knowing the exact color needed and dialing the Kelvin number?
Oh, that is a great question. And if you're in one of my classes and you're listening, I've given you this assignment. So I will give those at home listening the same assignment. For like a full day of shooting, I would recommend you pick a nice composition. You shoot it at 5,000K, 6,000K, 7,000K, 8,000K, and determine which one of those was closest to what your preference is. If you chose 6,000K in that lighting situation, then go a little bit less, go to 5,700, and go a little bit more to 6,300. Is one of those better, or was 6,000 it? And then move to a new composition and do the same thing. Shoot it at 5,000K, 6,000K, 7,000K, 8,000K. Maybe now you've moved into the shade and you're like, oh, 7,000K is what I like. Then again, back off a little to 6,700K, warm it up a little to 7,300K. Which one of those is right? And you nitpick yourself into the perfect white balance. By doing that assignment, if you do it enough for like a whole day or for 2 or 3 days, you'll just get to know how your camera handles white balance, and you'll educate yourself on how to achieve a closer white balance. I will just say my camera, what I call zero, is 5,600K. That's my starting point. I always take the first picture at 5,600K, and then I will either cool the photo off or warm the photo up. That's what K is. It's a temperature. So the higher the number, the hotter your photo, the cooler the number, or the lower the number, the cooler your photo. And you can get very good at white balance very fast. A lot of people who do post just set it to auto white balance. They're going to set that later anyway. But for me, you're standing there looking at it right then on the spot. When you have to go back to post and recreate color, recreate white balance, you're not remembering exactly what you saw. Now you're making a photograph after the fact instead of you made that decision, or at least to get as close as you can out in the field. So maybe in Photoshop or post-processing, you just need to tweak it a little. But just going, I would say auto white balance is off by 600 to 1,000 points in either direction, too hot or too cold, almost every single shot.
Mhm.
So in the field, you're never going to dial it in. And again, this is part of your artistic eye too. Some of my students like a very cold photo, and they just typically always end up on the lower part of the scale compared to everybody else. That's their preference. They are correct. I will only tell them when it looks whacked out. That's way too cold. Warm that up a little.
Mhm.
Some of my students like all their photos on the hot side. Just everything's a little bit warmer, a little bit yellower. And
That's me.
yeah, and I'll only correct them again when I'm like, whoa, your clouds are like yellow. That's too hot. Turn that down a little. Otherwise, that's part of their art. I'll let them make that determination. And that would be the same thing with the long exposure on a waterfall. Some people like it super, super smooth. I mean, like rivers where it's almost flattened out. Some people like it almost frozen or frozen. Neither one of those are wrong, because you cannot shoot a waterfall the way your eye sees it. Your eye sees a video. The only way to capture a waterfall the way your eye sees it is to shoot a video. But in
Right.
a photograph, you have to make an artistic decision of the shutter speed, which is going to be part of the art of that photo and what you want to convey to your viewer.
Do you have a favorite white balance for water?
No, because white balance is determined by light, not by water.
Right.
So it depends if I'm shooting that on a sunny day, on a cloudy day, or in the shade, or in reflected light. That'll determine my white balance, not the water.
And since you shoot in RAW, do you sharpen in the camera?
Yes, in that digital roll of film, um, they all come stock with the sharpness set somewhere. Most of the cameras set the sharpness right at what we call zero, right in the center. I typically would bump that up one notch. You cannot over sharpen in the camera or in post for that matter, if you want to sell big prints or you want to be published. Publishers flat out say, don't sharpen your image.
Right.
They won't use it. So it's something to keep in mind. I know on Facebook and Instagram, you know, what's popular is these hyper sharp images. And that looks great on a small screen, or it looks great in Facebook. And actually Facebook, when you post, messes with your picture anyway. So a little after market sharpening might help your image make it to Facebook a little more realistically. But as far as making big prints, sharpening is your enemy. If you over sharpen and you blow up to a 40 by 60 or bigger, you're going to see that, and you don't want to see that. So just keep that in mind if you're trying to do some professional work, that publishers don't want it sharpened, prints don't like it sharpened. So just keep that in mind.
And with shooting at f/18 to f/22, do you encounter lens aberrations, or how do you deal with that?
I don't get aberrations. I think diffraction or fall off is more what people would complain about. And that would typically happen in the corners of the photo in lenses, especially cheaper lenses at f/20 or f/22, you're going to see some fall off. But just take a look at the image I posted to the screen there. This one that's still hanging there. That's shot at f/20. Look right at the corner. There might be in the very corner a tiny bit less sharp, but that is just overthinking the photo way too much. Most zoom lenses these days, if it's a good brand name, are incredible. There's really no reason to shoot prime lenses, maybe for portraits, but carrying around 8 prime lenses in your bag as opposed to one all-around zoom is just not that important anymore. Lenses shoot pretty darn good.
And you talked about the color sensors in the different brand cameras. What are your feelings on the colors in the Olympus?
I'd put Olympus right in the middle of the pack. It's very similar to Panasonic, maybe slightly below Sony, although, the last 2 Sony models, I might bump it up with a Sony. I think it depends on the year of the camera and the size of the sensor, because crop sensor cameras carry a different color palette than full frame cameras. So I think there's a lot to answering that. I think Olympus, the mid-range models have a pretty darn good sensor tone. The higher end models so I'll just back up a step and say all cameras are in a dynamic range chase. Everybody's sensor wants to see more dynamic range. For me, that's a problem. The only way a camera can see more dynamic range is to take more color out of the camera, because you're taking the lights and darks out of the sensor in order to see a more dynamic range. So a good example, I shot the Canon 5, my first digital. I was very late bloomer. I shot slide film well into the digital world, was a 5D Mark II. It matched film pretty darn good. 5D Mark III, even better, a little more dynamic range. The best color palette I've ever seen in a camera is the 5D Mark III from Canon. Then they came out with the 5D SR. I got that. It has a slight more better dynamic range than a Mark III, but slightly less color, but the same color palette. So I'm happy there, and I need those 50 megapixels. Then the Canon 5D Mark IV came out, and I'm like, oh, what a good balance. A little less megapixels, more dynamic range. It'll have that Canon color. I bought it. I shot it for 2 months. I sold it. Because that camera saw 2.5 more stops than the SR. Some people say 4 more stops. It did not have any color in the camera, and the sensor had a gray cast to it, which means shooting a blue sky turned the sky a little yellowish, and I couldn't get past it. I would have to do Photoshop to shoot that camera. So not to say I didn't. When the color was really good, that camera worked really well. When the color was normal, it did not perform up to my standard. So I sold it. And now I've tripled down. I have 3 Canon 5D SRs because for me, that's the sweet spot. I hope to shoot that the rest of my career. As all these mirrorless cameras come out seeking more dynamic range, they're gonna pull less and less camera color in camera. So that's my theory on cameras. Just like with Nikons, The crop sensor cameras, say the 7000 series, the 5000 series, the 3000 series, pull way more color than their big boys. The 810, the 800, the 750, the 850 all pull far less color than their crop sensor cameras. If you're going to ask me which Nikon to buy, I'd say, what are your lenses? First of all, if you already have crop sensor lenses, I'd keep you in a crop sensor Nikon. If you wanted to upgrade to a full frame Nikon, the only one I'd recommend is the 850. And I will warn you, it does need Photoshop. You're not going to be able to take pictures like these in that camera. And that's not just my opinion. All my Nikon students see it in the back of their cameras also. And we do some extra stuff for Nikons. We pull the actual entire sensor tone a little bit towards the pink sometime, trying to correct that yellow tone in that sensor.
And then on your photos, does the high f-stops negate the need for tilt shift lenses to get depth of field?
Oh, for sure. I never use a tilt shift lens. I actually think it makes the images look funky. So for me, like again, these days that, zoom lenses that aren't stretched too far. And what I mean by that, a 24 to 105 is not stretched too far. A 24 to 400, that would be stretched way too far. That's not going to be a good lens. They just shoot sharp enough and good enough depth of field that I'm very satisfied. I'm very happy.
And you talked briefly about the macros. If you don't have a 100 macro, can you use an extension tube with the 24 to 105?
No, there is no substitute for a macro lens except to buy a macro lens. Everything else is what we call a cheater, whether it's a tube or a doubler or a macro. They actually just make macro things you screw on the end of your lens. None of that works like a macro lens. If you love macro photography, save up your money. Even if you buy a used one, there's nothing wrong with used lenses. Save yourself some money, buy yourself a legitimate macro lens. Nothing shoots like, I can see if I capture it just right, the smile on a bee's face. And you just can't do that with a regular lens.
Right. And how heavy or light a tripod do you use to keep the camera still with wind and flowing water?
Oh, wow. Yeah, tripod is almost as personal as the camera sensor and the camera body. It's such an important tool for me. I shoot a Gitzo Traveler legs with a Gitzo Traveler ball head. And I like less segments in a tripod. The more segments you have, the less sturdy the tripod's going to be, and the longer it's going to take you to set up. And one thing I'm very adept at is getting the camera from my backpack shooting on a tripod. I can do it in around 33 seconds. I can have the camera on my back, and 33 seconds later, I've taken my first photo. Part of the reason of that is I only have 3 leg segments, which means only loosening 2 knobs to drop the legs. So that's a consideration for me. Don't get sucked in by these tripods that fold down to only 9 inches across, because it'll take you 20 minutes to get it set up. And if a bear is in, if you're out there trying to capture a rainbow, you're never going to get it. So I recommend a tripod should stand up to your chin unless you're really tall without raising the middle bar. As soon as you start raising the middle bar, the tripod's becoming less sturdy. So some tall people, that's just not possible. You're going to have to raise that middle bar. I'm only 5'7", so for me, the Gitzo with just its legs out, the middle bar not raised, it's at my chin. That's perfect. My tripod with the ball head weighs 2.9 pounds. Now, I will admit that setup costs around $1,100. You can get very, very close to that nowadays with a Manfrotto or some of the newer tripods that are out for the $200 range, $150 to $200. You can get very close to that weight, same features, basically good enough tripod for 150, 250 bucks. So you don't need to go spend that. I love my tripod. I love it so much. I bought another one. I have at least 2 of everything because I do this for a living. Planning a trip takes a lot of work and is very expensive. And to be out in the field and not have gear means you've wasted a lot of money. So there's always an extra body on me. I always have the extra lenses, the extra tripod, not in my pack, but at least in my car or in my van. So be ready.
And what time of day were your best photos taken in Havasu Canyon?
Morning and evening, because we had no clouds. I just could not have light in the canyon. So midday, we were in camp, eating a big fat lunch, having a cup of coffee, relaxing. And by the way, the sun only landed in our camp for 2 hours a day, and we didn't want to miss that because it was kind of chilly. So we just sat in the sun, sat in our camp chairs. Uh, Another pro tip: a lightweight backpacking chair is worth its 1 pound weight in gold because you get to relax and recover. So sitting in the chair, drinking the coffee in the middle of the day, shoot all morning till lights in the canyon, take a break until lights out of the canyon, and go shooting again.
And then a few folks asked if this is being recorded, and it is. You will get a link to the recording later on tonight. It might be a little late, but once it's done processing, we'll get that out today.
Oh, and I should, before I forget, I just want to mention I'll be doing this again next month, and I don't have my calendar on me. Do you know which date that is, Michelle?
I do have that open. So part 2 of our webinars with Randall is going to be December the 3rd, also at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. So if you guys can join us again, we're going to continue the storytelling. And where are those photos taken from primarily?
Those photos are taken from an epic backtrap I did this October to the Enchantments.
Yeah.
And that is a really hard place to get a permit for. It's an extremely difficult hike to get to, but some of the best mountain scenery on the planet. And just the story of how I got a permit in there is worth tuning into to listen to. And I'll tell you the story how we achieved that permit and got in there. And yeah, the photos of that one will be fantastic also.
Right. Okay, and a couple more questions. We'll get through these. Thanks, guys, for hanging out here. These are good questions. Since you shoot on Canon, sorry, is landscape the picture style that comes in the camera, or is that one that you custom created?
Oh, and that's a good question because really through this whole thing, you only saw the images I shot in what I call the landscape roll of film. In a Canon, it that's one of the color palettes that's in there. So Canon has standard, landscape, neutral, faithful, monochrome. Some of them have fine detail, like my camera has a roll called fine detail. And then it just has 3 roles that are called 1, 2, and 3 that you can assign any of those to. So in my Canon, I'd never use faithful or neutral. They just have a horrible color palette. But I do know some post-processing buddies out there that like to shoot neutral because it has no color whatsoever. And they're going to assign all that color later. So that's what neutral is for, just neutral color, no real color. I have set up the standard roll, the landscape roll, the monochrome roll, if I didn't mention that, monochrome, black and white. And then I've also set up the fine detail roll and the 1, 2, and 3, which I assigned another standard with less color, less saturation, and 2 landscapes that have a little less saturation and even a little less saturation. Because believe it or not, there are sometimes the color is so intense that it will overwhelm the camera. And I need a quick go-to roll that has very little color in it. One of those instances is shooting macro photography of tulips. Red tulips freak the camera out. And a full strength roll of film is just going to blow that out. There's just no way you can be able to control that. So I can quickly jump over to one of those secondary landscape rolls that maybe saturation, instead of being turned up to 4, is only turned up to 1 above 0. And that's what those backup rolls are for. If you're a Nikon, you have some of the same things in there. You'll have landscape, but you'll have vivid, and you'll have standard and monochrome, and some have neutral. I don't think any Nikons have faithful. Some of the smaller Nikons, the crop sensor cameras, have vivid or more vivid. But in the camera, those are all set to 0, meaning 0 color. So believe it or not, my Canon 5D SR, which is a $3,800 body, out of the box, put a lens on it, fire it up, take a photo, my cell phone will outcolor it by double, easy.
Hmm.
Cell phone comes out of the box with a color palette set up. All DSLRs and mirrorless cameras come out of the box without the color palette set up. So for any of you folks out there who've got a big boy camera, you fire it up and you take a shot, you're like, well, this is weak. My cell phone outshoots this. Well, the cell phone definitely didn't outshoot it. It did outcolor it, however, but not to fear. A little bit of research, you can figure out how to set up the color palette in that camera to your own liking, and it will outcolor your cell phone.
And then by using EV-2/3, you are exposing more to the left. Do you lose detail because you're not exposing to the right, or do you underexpose to not lose detail in the white of the waterfalls?
Yes. So, and that's a histogram question there. Um, Inherently, photos, when they're finished, are on the dark side of the histogram. Unless you like to have no darks in your photo, then your photo is going to land somewhere in the middle or on the right side. When people say shoot on the right side of the histogram, that is to take into post-processing. That is not a finished all in camera photo. It is overexposed. So almost if you could see the histogram on all the photos I've shown you in the back of my camera, they're all between mid and all the way left, and some are pegged all the way left. And what people worry about is you're going to lose detail in your dark shadows. I don't care.
Right.
I'm not going to try to bring out those dark shadows. I'm going to leave them dark because that's what was there when I shot it. And really, most cameras have a good enough dynamic range. If you wanted to use a little highlight shadow and pull that out, most of the time you're going to be able to, but that's just not something I focus on. So just keep those two separate. If you're going to do some post-processing, you probably do want to look at your histogram. If you're not, you probably don't want to look at your histogram.
And do you find that the color on the back of your camera aligns close to what you find later at home on your computer?
Yes, but that is, oh boy,
That's a good one.
that is a great question. Let's open that up. I should have mentioned this. So I shoot in RAW, and there's two parts to a RAW file. Most people don't use this, and there's some people listening I'm not going to convince of this, and I'm okay with that. I've learned over the years that I can't make everybody a believer. Two parts to that RAW file. There's the base RAW file that Photoshop and Lightroom will open, and then there's all the in-camera work that sits right on top of it. So if I was to take any of these images I've shown you in the RAW file and open it in Photoshop, they would look totally bland because Photoshop will scrape off my in-camera work and it will not open. So the only way I can drive this home is I love to shoot in-camera black and whites also. If I shoot an in-camera black and white in RAW and I open in Photoshop, it's going to be color. Photoshop has no idea I shot a black and white photo. So I need to use the software that comes with the camera. For Canon, that's DPP. For Nikon, it's Nix. Sony has its software. Panasonic has its software. I open that RAW file in the software that came with the camera. Bam, it looks exactly how I shot it because it can see my entire RAW file. That means
Great.
it has included all those presets in the camera. So that I'm so glad somebody brought that up because I always have to try to remember in my lessons to anybody shooting in RAW, they raise their hands, I give them the RAW speech. You can no longer open this RAW file in Photoshop or Lightroom. And all you have to do is open it in the software that came with the camera and do a very simple file convert save as. Convert it to another file, you capture your in-camera work, and then you can open that file in Photoshop or Lightroom or any other program. If you shoot in JPEG, you don't need any of those steps. JPEG is an already processed photo. It can come right out of your camera and go into any program at all.
And then someone said when they noticed when setting up their new Canon R5 rolls of film that there are 3 settings under sharpness, and she's not sure what to set those 3 at.
Okay, I will try to give you some. So the first setting in sharpness is strength. In the landscape roll, you want to turn that up 1 notch. In the standard roll, you want to turn that up 2 notches. You'll want to skip over fitness and threshold and leave them where they came out of the box. And then you would jump down to your contrast, and you're going to knock that up 2 notches from where it came stock in the camera. And you're going to drop down to saturation, and you're either going to turn it up 3 notches or 4 notches, depending on how much color you like. And that would finish the landscape or standard roll of film. And that'd be very similar for Nikon too, for vivid, landscape, or standard. You would knock up the strength 1 click or 2 clicks, depending on where it starts. Drop down, skip the other things, drop down to contrast, bump it up 2 notches, drop down to saturation, take it up 3 or all the way up 4. In Canons, leave the color tone alone. And to begin with, in Nikons, leave the color tone alone or hue, but later, because as you get to know a Nikon sensor, you may want to tweak that, but that's getting a little advanced. And basically that works for all the brands, that same kind of recipe. And then you'll get to know that some of the other rolls of film in there, they put that sharpness much, much lower. Like in monochrome, you're going to have to take that up 3 notches to get to what you want it to be, like the other rolls of film, set to the same level. And just for anybody out there who can understand this, I'll give you the monochrome settings also. So you'd open up monochrome, typically sharpness would go up 3 bumps because it's set really low for monochrome. I don't know why. And then contrast is going to go up 3 bumps because that's all we got is contrast. There is no saturation in black and white, but there is a filter effect. Old school black and white film shooters always held a red filter in front of their lens because red is more gray. That lets the camera see more shades of gray. So in a digital camera, you can just go put the red filter on and you're mimicking film shooting. And then you can drop down to tone and you could switch that black and white over to like a sepia, which I don't do. I like standard black and white, but an old rusty car might get me to go bump that over to sepia just to make that photo look all worn out too. But typically I like a standard black and white. So I know it's so much harder to speak than just show. In my classes, it's very easy for me to help you set up all your camera color palettes, but it's very hard to do on paper for me to try to explain over the phone. But some of you probably got that. You'll probably go experiment with that. And just remember, if you're shooting in RAW, you can't open that RAW file in Photoshop or Lightroom. It won't look anything like it does in the back of your camera.
Sorry, do you calibrate your monitor at all, or you just use it?
I don't really calibrate it. I do lighten or darken it. So because in my Edmunds gallery, the back half of that gallery is a print shop, and I run four Epson printers back there. I do need to figure out what each printer needs for it to come out looking like the back of my camera. The last monitor I got, I had to brighten just a little bit in order for it to kind of match my camera to kind of get it to come out the printers. But printing is just, geez, we could do 5 webinars just on trying to learn how to print because that's a real animal. I will just say, if I took one file off here, the one we're staring at, and I put it through my 17-inch Epson, I need to use the exposure in Photoshop and move it up 20 points for it to come out looking like the screen. If that same photo comes out my canvas printer, the 7800, I need to darken that photo by 5 points to have it come out looking like the screen. And in my newest printer, which is my new 44-inch printer, the P8000, I have to darken it by lighten it by 40 points to get it come out looking like the screen. Now, most people would use a profile to kind of make that happen. I don't find most profiles to be super accurate. And there's also each paper that you print on has its own profile. So boy, you can get really involved in profiles. What I do is I have scripts, which means in Photoshop, I've made a script for my 7800 printer and I run the image through that script. It makes the adjustments and then I run it through the printer and then it comes out looking like my camera. But boy, I am sorry for everybody out there who has a printer and can't get the photo to come out right. I know your pain. It's a difficult thing. It's a whole nother animal.
No, I bought one secondhand and no one warned me.
Yep, it's a tough one.
It's a learning curve.
Just make sure you got lots of paper and lots of ink because you're going to throw a bunch of stuff away while you try to figure it out.
That's true. Would you recommend that a student can start with the 5DM3 and a good lens? That a Canon?
I'm not familiar with, oh, the 5D Mark III?
I think so.
Then yes, great camera. Heck yeah.
And what do you think of the Canon 70?
Another good camera. A 7D I would consider a more all-around camera. So a 5D SR is really a landscape camera. It is meant to be on a tripod. It's meant to run slow. If you're an all-around shooter, you like to do some wildlife, some sports, some people, and landscapes, a crop sensor camera might be good for you, or the 5D Mark III or Mark IV. Not the SR. It's just going to be too slow of a camera. But the 7D has a very similar color palette to my cameras, so the colors will be great. It's a much faster camera than mine. It can shoot a whole lot more frames per second. So if you're interested in wildlife and fast photography also, that might be a better pick for you. But good camera. Actually, there really aren't too many Canons that I don't recommend. Even a T8i with an 18 to 135 lens, which you can buy for $900, will shoot just like all the images you just seen. Just have,
Someone asked if you're sponsored by Canon because you seem to love them a lot.
gosh, they should pay me, right? I am not sponsored by Canon, and I will tell you this without bragging, I have sold well over $1 million of Canon cameras for them, and I get nothing in return for that.
You need a
It's
finder's fee.
I know. It's just when I teach, Canon is the easiest and it has the best color palette. And again, second would be Nikon, and then all the other ones come in third, except for Fuji comes in last. So
Right. And then
that
someone asked about the color palette on a Sony. He wants to know if the Sony A7R2 has a better color palette than the 3 or 4.
yes, it does.
Okay.
Because again, the 3 and 4, they tried to get more and more dynamic range. And I will say I watched a lot of professional photographers who do post-processing jump on that latest Sony, all excited, and immediately have to jump back. Or in a couple of months, jump back because they couldn't handle the weird sensor tone in the latest Sony. So my opinion, you're better off with that Mark II. But again, I'm an all-in camera shooter, not a post-processor. So I know post-processors out there, I just made them crazy. And that's okay. If you're a post-processor, you're looking for a different camera than if you want to do most of the work in the camera. So no right or wrong way there, just a personal preference.
A couple of folks asked how they can get in touch with you or find out about your workshop. So I just put that link to your website in the chat window. It's randalljhodges.com. The J is important.
Yeah, and jump on the website. There's a lessons tab there. It has local classes to my gallery up here in Edmonds, north of Seattle and Washington. But I teach, you'll see all over the Western United States and Canada. So you can come out for a 6-day trip to Death Valley. I have some availability in February coming up this next year. You'll notice some of my big classes for next year are already sold out. That does happen. But there is some availability there. I've recently put up 2 Wildflowers and Mount Rainier weekend classes, just 2 days. Those are still both available. I have a couple of fall color classes in October next year, still available. And my local classes, if you're up in my area, are still available. So you can find some availability there.
And then someone wants to know, how do you clean your tripod when it gets wet in water?
Oh, easy one there. If it gets wet, I'm not concerned about it. I try to just set it up and let it dry when I'm back in the house. The only time I really worry about cleaning it is if I've stuck it in the mud or I've been on the beach. The beach is rough on gear. And after a good trip to the beach, all the gear should be wiped down. Actually, I cheat usually when I'm on the beach. If it's a backpacking beach, no, I got to open it up and stick it in a creek. I'll find a creek and stick the whole tripod in there and wash that beach salt and everything off my tripod. And then I'll still take it home and wipe it down and try to dry it. If you're on a beach like Cannon Beach or something with hotels on it, all the hotels have hoses so you can spray off your feet before you track it into the rooms. Well, that's a great place to set up your tripod and use their hose and spray that sucker down. But don't be afraid. I put that thing in the bathtub, turn on the shower, clean off my tripod, wipe off my camera. I also, after the beach, I have to use the Singh-Ray lens cleaner. What's that called, Michelle?
Oh, the Ray View.
Rayview, thank you. Yes, that's very good for cleaning those filters. And it also puts a little kind of coating on there. It helps them not get as dirty as fast and to not fog as much. So after a good trip to the beach, I lay out all my filters, polish them up with fresh lens cloths with the Rayview, and then stick them back in my carrying case. So I'm ready to go for the next trip.
Um, let's see. Do you use an ND filter for waterfall or only the graduated ND filters? And which ND filter do you use?
For waterfalls, I do carry a two-stop solid. I don't use any screw-on ND filters because I usually have a polarizer on.
Right.
Um, so, but that's not my goal. I mean, I will use the two-stop ND filter, or you can just use one of your hard graduated filters and try to cover the whole lens. Unfortunately, if your lens is a bigger diameter, like mine's a 77, an ND filter won't quite cover the whole lens. A split won't, but a solid will. So yeah, pulling out a two-stop, but I'd much rather shoot it in the right light, which for me means no sun on the waterfall. I'm going to want to shoot it in either shade or overcast, and I can always get a long enough exposure in shade or overcast with a small aperture like f20 or f22.
And then when you're picking the filters, what's the best or most used size to buy for the Canon lenses that you suggest?
Oh, I highly recommend, no matter what size your lens is, you get the 4x6 filters, the 100x400. Even if your lens is smaller, you could get away with what we call a pea-size filter. Sometimes you want to handhold those filters, which means you need to pinch it with your thumb and forefinger to hold it up to the lens. And if your filter's too small, you're going to end up shooting the back of your thumb a lot. So having a bigger filter, a 4x6, is highly recommended. And plus, most photographers will graduate to a bigger diameter lens, so no reason to buy those filters twice. Just start with the 4x6, and as your lens, the diameter gets bigger because you've upgraded, you're covered. You just need a new ring for your holder. Now, there are some really wide angle lenses that require a bigger, like an 82 millimeter or bigger. I don't shoot those lenses. I
Right.
don't need to,
Well, and
because
Stingray being who they are, and since they make all their filters in small batches, if there is a size that's not available on the website, if you give them a call, most chances are they'll make it for you, and it won't cost probably as much as you think.
that's
Um,
right.
so yeah, so they do customize because they're already producing in small batches. Um, and then also, I just wanted to put out there too, if you're using a circular polarizer, one of the tips that we've heard from others is to use the step-up rings. So if you have two lenses, buy the filter for the larger lens, and you can use the step-up rings to fit it down to your smaller lens.
That's a great money saving tip there. Because of the way I like to shoot, I make sure that all my lenses are 77 millimeters.
Right. And what are the advanced bumps for Nikon? Less yellow?
Yes, to take the yellow out of the camera, you have to go to what's called your white balance shift. It's actually a map of your sensor. And you'll see a Nikon sensor stock sits right in the yellow. So you would pull that sensor a little bit pink and a little bit blue to try to kind of mimic a Canon a little bit. And I do that with a lot of my students who are not seeing the tone they want. Just remember, if you pull your sensor, it stays that way permanently. So if you're pulling the entire tone of your camera's sensor, you need to remember to put it back, or just be happy where you left it. I've had some students, they wanted to learn that trick. I see them again in a year. I'm like, why is your photos all pink? And we go in there and they never set that back. So just a friendly reminder that if you move that sensor tone, it's staying that way.
We have a tip and a question from Sam. Sam says, if you use the Adobe RAW with Photoshop and you open image as an object in the camera settings are used. So when you're in Photoshop, go to open image as object, and it won't toss out the color, he said.
And that's a great tip. Thanks for mentioning it. Unfortunately, it does not work with every camera. So it will work with some of the models. So that's something to test if you don't want to take the extra step of simply converting the camera and the camera software.
Right.
And Lightroom, it'll do that as a plugin in Lightroom also. It just doesn't work for every camera model.
And the scripts that you use for printing, do they add sharpening or only exposure and color?
I don't have to change the color for any of my printers. I only have to change, for the most part, the exposure. But I will say I work with a company, my Cannon Beach gallery. We sell a ton of metal prints. We have them in my Edmonds gallery too. And I use Bay Photo for my metal prints.
Mhm.
And in metal prints inherently have because they're dye sublimation, they don't have all the inks that an inkjet printer like in my gallery uses. So the blacks can sometimes get a little funky. So sometimes in the metal print script, before I send it to Bay Photo, there's a little highlight shadow added to bring up the black just a little so it won't go funky on me. But that's just trial and error. I Same thing, I have a company in Nevada called Nevada Art Printers. They print my Lumichrome HD acrylics, and I know they make their own adjustment, and they know my shooting style, so they try to keep it real to the back of my camera. And I've worked with them just a little bit to get there, so they know how to handle my files. So printing is just another animal. Some people simply get past it by loading a profile, either for the paper or for the printer or for both, and that works really well for them. I wasn't so fortunate.
Okay. And what models of Epson printers do you have?
I have a Epson. I better step back there, make sure I get this
Yep.
right. Right now, my main printers are an Epson SureColor P800, an Epson SureColor P8000, and an Epson 7800. The P800 and the P8000 have the exact same color palettes, but the P800 has to be brightened by 20 points, where the P8000 has to be brightened by 40 points to have those come out looking the same. The P800, the 17-inch printer, is simply a paper printer for me. The 7800 printer is a canvas printer for me, and it prints my small canvas, 8 by 12s, 14 by 22, 16 by 24s. The P8000 is the big boy printer. It either loads a roll of 20-inch canvas or a roll of 44-inch canvas or paper on both sizes. So it prints the big photos for me.
And then someone said right now they have the graduated ND, Singh-Ray, Galen Rowell 3-stop. Do you think I need to invest more in the LB warming filter and reverse filter?
Uh, if you're on a budget and you only have a 3-stop, I would invest in a 1-stop and a 2-stop. The 3-stop just doesn't handle all situations. Sometimes, like a mountain reflection, you only need the 1-stop to balance that from top to bottom. Sometimes in a sunrise, you only need a 2-stop because the sun's coming up behind you, at least on the West Coast, I should say that. So I only need a 2-stop. And then sometimes at sunset, I might need 6 stops, which means stacking all 3 of those filters together. So my first investment would be to make sure you have a full set of graduated ND filters, split neutral density filters. And then my second investment would be into the light bright warming polarizer. And then if you still had some money left over, then more of the specialty filter, like a reverse density or maybe a Randall J. Hodges Mountain V filter. If you're a hiker, those come in really handy for me, would be next. But actually just getting that full stop of graduateds would be number one.
Right. And then we have a couple more questions. I know we're coming up on 2 hours, so Randall, if you have time, we'll get these last couple of questions answered.
Let's knock them out.
All right. Do you have any comments on medium format cameras?
Film or digital? That would be the first question.
Right.
And I'll just make a comment anyway without knowing that. I think if that's your artistic style and you want to pack around a big boy medium format camera, by all means, go ahead. That's a specialty all its own. Is it necessary? I don't think so. I mean, I can make really humongous prints off almost any camera. You know, I print for other people, not just myself. Even off a T8i, I can produce a 40 by 60 print, no problem. And off my 50 megapixel camera, if I wanted to convert that to a 16-bit, I've got a 260 megabyte file. That's humongous. I've had companies make billboards out of that. So, you know, it's more of an artistic choice rather than needing it for large prints anymore, would be my opinion. So, and remember, that's just one guy's opinion.
And then do you use UV filters?
I don't. A UV filter is just a glass protector. It doesn't do anything besides protect the glass. And as an outdoor landscape photographer, if there's not a polarizer on my camera, then there's a split neutral density filter on my camera. And actually, my camera goes to bed back in its bag with a circular polarizer always on it.
Mm.
Um, and by the way, pro tip, for the thin mount polarizers, you should also get a Singh-Ray cap, because the thin mount polarizers, you can't snap like a Canon or Nikon cap in there because it's just too thin. So
Right.
you need Singh-Ray's over cap to sit over that.
Good tip. And then for landscape, how do you determine the appropriate f-stop?
Oh, if it's an open landscape and I want depth of field, that's easy. It's f20 or f22. F18, that's the minimum I would go. The only time I back away from that is if I particularly don't want all that depth of field. A good example, maybe 40 yards out there, I have a bank of white bark aspens, and I really want the eye to go to those aspens. I'm going to shoot at f8, let my foreground be soft, let my background be soft, let those aspens be tack sharp right in the middle. That's going to draw your eye right to those aspens. But usually I want your eye to drop into my foreground, and I want it to weave its way through to the whatever the subject is in the background. One rule that'll help all you photographers out there: less sky, more foreground. Tip your camera down. That's the number one problem I see with people, is they put too much empty sky in their photos.
Mm.
If there's nothing dramatic in that sky, minimize it and maximize that foreground. Now, if you have a big dramatic sky with popcorn clouds and super color, that's different. That is very interesting. But if it's just a alpenglow or just a blue sky, there's nothing happening, look for something to fill that photo in the foreground, not in the background.
A great tip. And then someone said they use the, oh wait, no, we answered that one. If you send a photo to a photo service to be printed as a photographic print, do you need the scripts?
No, you do not.
You did
If
not.
if the service is good, they know the adjustments they need to make from looking at your photo. If you're sending it to Costco, well, luck of the dice, 50-50 on that one. Costco prints a billion photos. They don't look at your photo. The file just goes through. The size is set. It prints out. Maybe you get lucky. You're very happy with it. But the very next time you send it to Costco, it doesn't look anything like that print, because it was different people, different machine, different Costco. Um, so if you really want good prints, going to a specialty lab is worth the extra money. And really, it's not usually that much more money. I mean, for example, my canvas prints that I print for other people are very competitive at Costco, a little more on average, but I'm going to look at your photo. And if it needs adjustments, I'm going to make the adjustments if it needs to be lightened, darkened. And I'm just going to ask you, even though I don't post-process my photos, I'm going to ask you, do you want me to make this photo look as good as possible? Some people are like, no, no, I want it to be as I shot it. And some people are like, I don't know what I'm doing, do it. So I will. And that's the kind of, I would recommend when you send something to print, you want a lab that knows how to handle different images and different cameras.
Are there some labs that you'd recommend?
Gosh, not really, because I do so much of my own printing. I would recommend Bay Photo for metal prints. And I would recommend Nevada Art Printers for Lumachromes, but I'm recommending only those two products because that's the only ones they print for me. I don't have knowledge about. I'm sure they both do great job with canvas and acrylics and everything else, but I'm just not familiar because I do all that. I do all my own canvas, all my own paper prints in house.
And can you make a 40 by 60 from crop sensor cameras such as the Canon 7D?
Sure can, no problem.
And last question of the evening, what types of polarizing filters do you use for all your lenses? I think you said
They're
at the beginning what you're packing in your bag.
Yeah, they're all light, bright, warming polarizers. And I'll just repeat one more time what's in my gear list, not just what's in my bag. I have 2 Gitzo tripods with ball heads. I have 3 Canon 5D SR bodies. I have a 24 to 105 Mark II lens, a 16 to 35 Mark II lens, a 100 to 400 Mark II lens, and a 100 millimeter macro. I carry 2 full sets on me of 1, 2, and 3, and 4 stop split neutral density filters in hard. That's the Galen Rowell.
Mhm.
I always have 2 light, bright, warming polarizers on me, 2 cable releases on me, 5 batteries on me, and about a dozen lens cloths on me. That's pretty much all the gear I own.
All right. So that's it for the questions. So thank you so much for everybody who stuck it out with us and hung in there with all these questions.
And
And thank you so much, Randall, for presenting for us for tonight.
Oh, it's always a pleasure, and thank everybody for joining us out there, and thanks for the great questions. And just remember, there's no right or wrong way in photography, only your way. And lastly, I'll just say happy and safe shooting out there, everybody.
All right. Well, have a great night. Thanks.
You